All right, it is 7 o'clock on Wednesday, February 15th, and we are going to get started here. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Just so everyone knows, this is a recorded session. So if you don't get to pay the closest attention tonight while we're live, don't worry. We're going to record everything and post it online on the website. That is going to be underneath the visit tab right on our homepage where our panel sessions are all put up. So if it's any of the Demystified series that we've been going through for financial aid or any of the other webinars that we've put on through admissions, they are all under the same radar. You can get right in there through the visit portion of our main website. Throughout the night, Ryan and I will be trying to answer questions in the Q&A session or the chat function as we go through the rest of the evening. So if anything that Ryan says kind of pops a question into your head, go ahead and throw it in there. I will either answer them live or we can have Ryan answer them live at the end of the session. We'll also have a little bit of a live Q&A at that point. We'll answer some frequently asked questions towards the end as well. Just so if I don't immediately respond to you, just know that either your answer is going to come at the end or throughout the session tonight. If you guys haven't joined us before, my name is Zach Sawyer. I'm an assistant director of admissions here at Maine Maritime. And my other panelist here is Ryan French, who is our director of financial aid. We have been putting together a series about financial aid, the process, not only stuff that's relevant here at MMA, but that you can utilize no matter where you go. It is general information. We're not going to get too specific on any one portion of these topics, but we have siloed them into some rather large bins. So if you have questions about the FAFSA, we do have a session about that. If you're looking for outside sources of scholarship funding, we have a whole session about that. Tonight's session focuses on the loan process. We are going to go into kind of a big overview of this, whether it's good to borrow, whether it's not good to borrow, whether you need to take all of the money, whether you only need part of the money that is offered. All these questions will be talked about throughout the session tonight. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Ryan jump right into things. But again, if you guys have any questions throughout the night, just throw them in the chat or throw them in the Q&A session, and I'll try to get back to you live. All right.
Thank you, Zach. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fourth, I think, in our series on financial aid, Demystified, all about loans tonight. This happens to be my background. Zach and I actually both used to work for a local financial institution, and I did some consumer lending, some business lending. So I have a lot of technical knowledge on private lending. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I started going through all of this information, I put a way more information into this webinar than I think was probably feasible or doable in the hour that we have this evening. So there's a lot of information to know about loans, and it's okay if you don't know everything. You know, there are some things that you need to know, some things that you'll pick up along the way. I'm going to try and go over as much information as I can that I think is really important for you to know. If you have more specific questions about things, obviously put them in the chat and I can try and answer them. There are a lot of resources online for more specific information if something jumps up that you wanted more information on. And at the end of this, I'm going to just put up on the screen sort of a slide with some terminology, with a little bit of information about some of the terms that I go over. If I don't hit something and you have questions about it, hopefully there'll be some answers in there. And I'm just going to leave it up at the end so that it's in the recording that you can refer to it later, but I'm probably not going to go into too much detail into some of the specifics on a lot of the loan terminology. So we'll go through it and we'll see if you have questions. All right. So right off the bat, I wanted to do some review. If you've been with us before in the previous webinar episodes, you will have definitely seen this slide. I think I've included it in every one of the webinars we've done so far. Very broad question: what is financial aid? Financial aid are funds provided to students and their families to help pay for post-secondary educational expenses, often dependent on financial need. There are many different types and sources of financial aid. There are grants, there are scholarships, and there are loans. There's also a category of work study. And these come from all kinds of sources, federal government, state government, private institutions, our institution, all over the place. So it's kind of all encompassing, and we've gone over a lot of those individual categories in previous webinars. So if you have questions about any of those specific things, you can check back. Tonight, we're going to really go into a little bit more detail on loans. We have talked a little bit about loans when we did the FAFSA. We talked about the federal loans. I am going to review some of that information just because I think it's a good primer. I'm going to go over it relatively quickly. So again, if you have more questions about the next like 2 or 3 slides, you can refer back to previous webinar episodes, or obviously ask questions in the chat. So the first big concept when we talk about loans that we definitely need to like get in our minds is cost of attendance. Cost of attendance is a budgeting tool that we use in financial aid. And it's broken up into 2 major categories. There are direct costs of attendance, there are indirect costs of attendance. Some of you've gotten this information a couple times. I've definitely shown this information a couple times. But the reason this is an important distinction is because direct costs are the things the school is going to bill you for. So when we talk about tuition and fees, room and board, license fees and uniforms, depending on what major you're in, you might get charged some of those things. Those are items that are actually going to show up on your bill. But when you're budgeting for school, there are other things that you have to consider. And so we include in our total cost of attendance, we include things like books and laptops, personal expenses, random supplies, travel expenses, things like that, that the school is never going to bill you for, but is important to consider as you're planning and budgeting for school. And there is an important distinction between those 2 things as we start doing some calculations and figuring out, do I need a loan? Do I not need a loan? How much do I want? So this is also a review slide that I put in our FAFSA slide where we are explaining need and gap calculations. Little arithmetic for you folks. The first one is the need calculation. This is how basically lenders and the federal government determines what your quote unquote financial need is. Need is based on your total cost of attendance as calculated by the school, that budgeted number. And you subtract out your expected family contribution. So EFC is a number that is determined after doing the FAFSA. The federal government, does all the math on the tax return that you have filed, the information that you've submitted, demographic and tax information that you submitted on the FAFSA, and they come up with this calculation. It's a dollar amount, and it's the dollar amount that the federal government says that your family could reasonably expect to pay towards your student's education. It is not often a realistic number, frankly, as many of you may have already noticed, but it is, fair in the sense that everybody is rated along the same basic categories. So you take that cost of attendance, you subtract out your expected family contribution, and that is your financial need. Need that's basically your original financial need before any other calculations have been made. That's important for a couple of reasons. I'm going to go into that in a second, but just keep that in your hat. The next one is the gap calculation. So this is really more for budgeting purposes when you start really looking into what do I need to cover in order to make school work for me. You do this gap calculation, which is going to be your cost of attendance, and you're going to subtract out, instead of an expected family contribution, you're going to look at estimated financial aid. If you were with us on our last webinar episode, we talked about estimated financial aid, the anticipated total of all federal, institutional, private financial aid. We talked about private scholarships. We talked about endowed scholarships. We talked about all of that stuff, and that's all encompassed within that estimated financial aid. So as you are budgeting and you've got your total cost of attendance number, and then you've got your budgeted or planned or estimated financial aid, you can then come up with this financial gap number, which is that remaining budget that's left over after you've subtracted out all of that financial aid from the cost of attendance. And that really, I kind of hammered it in when I went over cost of attendance in the previous episode, but it really is a budgeting tool. So it's important. It's an important distinction to make as you're doing these calculations, that these aren't necessarily the numbers that are going to show up on a bill, but they're really, really important and helpful numbers as you start figuring out a budget for the upcoming school year. So one more review slide here. I just want to talk about federal loans. This is information that showed up in the financial aid offer webinar that came out not last month, but the month before. And this is, basic breakdown of, I wanted to go over the difference between need-based loans, non-need-based loans, and how the federal loans look. Anybody who's completed the FAFSA should have been offered some type of federal loans. This was an example sample offer letter that I put together. Your typical student. This student happens to be from out of state based on the tuition rate. And you can see up on the top there, you've got your direct costs on the left, you've got your indirect costs on the right. And then down there at the bottom, you've got your estimated financial aid. In this case, if you look here, can I get back there? There we go. If you look here, this is the student's federal aid that they've been offered. That's the loan that they were offered from doing the FAFSA. The maximum federal direct loan amount that a first-year dependent undergraduate student can get is $5,500. When we look at this other example, this is a different student, similar situation, but maybe different financial situation, different FAFSA information that they've put together. On this second offer letter, you see that it looks a little different. And the reason for that is because of that need calculation. So for both of these students, if you do the math, you can see they both received this $5,500 in loans. However, because of that need calculation, one student received some subsidized loans and unsubsidized loans, whereas the first student received the entire amount unsubsidized. So when that need calculation is originally done, cost of attendance minus expected family contribution as determined by the FAFSA, it determines how that loan gets split out. That's just a little review. We went over a lot of that information before. I just wanted to make sure we went over it again. And I'll also just one more time mention tonight that the subsidized loans, the reason that the distinction is important is the subsidized loans are interest-free while the student is in school, meaning subsidized, meaning the government, sort of covers in interest accrual while the student's in school. And on the unsubsidized loans, interest is accruing while the student is in school. So just important to keep that in mind as well. So done with review. I know I went over a lot of that very quickly. Oh. Well, sorry about that. Done with the review. I know I went over a lot of that information very quickly. Again, if you have more information on a lot of those slides, it's available in our previous webinars. But I think some of the important questions are coming up as we talk about loans. The first one that I wanted to address is, why would I borrow a loan? There are a lot of reasons why someone would choose not to borrow a loan. And I would say most of the people that I talk to would rather get through school without ever borrowing any money. And honestly, I totally appreciate that impulse. And it is my goal here in this office to get you out of here with the least amount of loan debt as possible. But at the end of the day, some people are going to need to borrow loans. So some of the reasons why you might feel more comfortable borrowing are the credit benefits. So borrowing loans, both federally and private, is a great way to establish and build credit history. Obviously, as long as you repay those loans. As you have those loans on your balance, like as a student who maybe doesn't have any credit history, is applying for and getting private loans, getting those federal loans, those sit on his credit report. And as they're making payments on those loans, it is improving that credit history and creating credit history. So as these students are graduating, going out into the world, getting car loans, getting mortgages, things like that, they've got an established credit history behind them. It's also important to note the low default rate. So Maine Maritime Academy's student loan default rate is 1.8%. That is pretty low compared to the national average. And what that means is the vast majority of our students are able to repay their loans once they enter the workplace. which is important. And the reason that we have that low default rate is for there's a couple reasons why our default rate is so low. One of them is job placement. So 95% of our graduates have jobs within 90 days of graduation. Those are real numbers. And the real benefit of that is that this gives our graduates the ability to repay those loans very quickly. The other important metric that contributes to our low default rates, I think, is our return on investment. So 2019 Georgetown University study reported that Maine Maritime Academy was #1 in Maine and in the top 10 schools in the country for return on investment, even beating out Harvard University. So this is, students are not only graduating and coming right into jobs, but they're graduating and coming into really well-paying jobs. So they're in a position to start making payments on these loans pretty much right out of the gate. Unlike a lot of students who come out of school with loan debt and unfortunately aren't in higher level positions, aren't in high paying positions immediately after graduation. There are some hard truths that I just want to mention. 41% of students nationally are going to borrow some loans. So if we're asking the question, why would I borrow? It might just come down to the fact that college is expensive and some people aren't going to be able to get as many scholarships as other people. They're not going to be able to find a lot of that free aid, but depending on their family financial situation, they may not be able to get any grants from the federal government or the state government, and they might not have the cash to cover school. So for a lot of students, at the end of the day, they're probably going to have to borrow something while they're here at school. But as we start figuring out and budgeting and moving forward, there's a couple big questions that a lot of families tend to ask. So as we're looking ahead, as we're trying to budget and forecast the financing for the future, the two questions that I get most often as we're talking about loans are, how much money can I borrow? Meaning, what is the maximum loan amount that I can borrow? And how much do I need to borrow? I.e., what is the minimum amount of money that I need to borrow in order to cover my bill? And I think these are both really good questions to ask and really good numbers to know, because it gives you a really great range. So as you're making your budgeting plans and you're forecasting and you're planning ahead for the academic year and future years, you can figure out, okay, here's the window that I need to be in. And that's a really good first step to take as you start figuring out, do I need a loan, and potentially how much do I need? So that first one may be a kind of familiar math problem. There is the total cost of attendance minus your estimated financial aid. So we did a gap calculation on a previous slide. This is the same math problem. So when you're talking about maximum loan amount, you're talking about that total cost of attendance. That is all those things the school is going to bill you for, including all of the things that we pad your cost of attendance budget with, and remind you of your personal expenses, your travel expenses, books, supplies, things like that. So it's that total cost of attendance number. You subtract out that estimated financial aid, so any scholarships that you've gotten, any other like federal loans that you've gotten, federal grants, state grants, things like that that you've gotten. You subtract all of that out, and that number is the number that you can borrow. Now, for a lot of students, that's going to be more than you actually need, but it is an important number to know as you are budgeting and planning ahead. How much could I borrow technically if I wanted to? The next one is, how much do I need to borrow? I would say this is our estimated minimum loan amount, and this is a slightly more complicated math problem. The reason this is more complicated is because we have to change a number of the factors, and we have to do a little bit more estimation as we are planning ahead. So the first difference you'll see here is that in the first math problem, we were talking about total cost of attendance. In the second math problem, we're talking about direct cost of attendance. So if you remember back to our cost of attendance slide, direct cost of attendance are the things that we actually bill you for, that the billing office is actually putting down on a bill and saying that you owe the school. The reason that's important is because those are the things that you actually need to pay for in order to cover the bill. So This can be sometimes hard to estimate. We can look at those, again, we can look at that cost of attendance budget and make a pretty good guess. But you sign up for extra classes and maybe get charged an additional tuition rate, or you're signed up for a bunch of science classes with lab credits or lab charges associated with them. Those are things that we don't necessarily account for in that direct cost of attendance number. So the numbers might be a little different, but we can usually figure pretty closely what that direct cost of attendance is going to be and come up with a pretty good estimate. The estimated financial aid part is pretty much the same. It's any private scholarships that you're planning on getting, institutional, endowed, grant money, things like that. All of that is pretty much the same as the previous calculation. The additional line item here are payments to school. So some students out there are going to have college savings plans, 529s. Some students out there are going to be in the position to just make payments to the school, set up payment plans maybe, or maybe, grandma and grandpa wanted to, pay for first semester of school or something like that. All of those payments, all of those basically cash amounts that you want to pay towards school, we want to take out. But as we're budgeting, we need to sort of plan ahead for those things. So that's why it maybe isn't something that's going to be as straightforward, but we can kind of plan ahead and look at all of those pieces of information to figure out, okay, at the end of the day, here's how much the bill is going to be. Here's what all my aid is going to be. Here's maybe the cash that I have available to pay here or there. And then at the end of the day, okay, do I need to get a loan? How much does it need to be? And that's your minimum loan amount. So next step, you've done all this budgeting, you've done all this planning. Now you got to find a loan, right? You've decided you might need a private loan. There's a bunch of resources out there. This is not going to be a fully exhaustive list. So I'm going to, give you some highlights, give you some places to start looking. The first place that you can start looking is Elm Select. That's a website that we have partnered with that lists a lot of the big name private lenders out there. Elm Select makes it really easy for you to compare and contrast a lot of those big name lenders, see some of the rates that they're offering, some of the terms that they're offering, compare some of those rates and terms against each other and see maybe what makes the most sense, what might fit the best. It also links directly to all of those lenders, so you can go straight to their applications and apply straight through that website if you wanted to do that. The next thing I wanted to bring up, because I'm sure people have asked about it, is the parent loan for undergraduate students, aka the PLUS loan. So the PLUS loan is a federal loan program. It's very similar to the unsubsidized student loan program, except this is distinguished because the parent is the borrower in this situation. So the parent is filling out a loan application. They become the primary borrower on this loan. So a couple important distinctions between a PLUS loan and a student loan. First off, the student loans are capped at a certain amount per year. A student can only borrow so much as a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior from the federal government. Also, the only requirement to be offered those loans is to have completed the FAFSA. So there's no credit check that they're doing. Every student who's completing the FAFSA is going to get offered some loans, certainly as a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Sometimes as you get further along, there are loan caps that the federal government puts on those student loans, but for the most part, every student who's completing the FAFSA is going to get offered some form of federal loans. The PLUS loan is a little different because it is a parent loan. The parent does have to apply for it. So it's a slightly different process. There is an application process. There's a point on there where you have to indicate how much you want or how much you need. So it's important to remember all of that budgeting conversation that we had before. But one of the important distinctions here is also that the federal student loans are fixed interest rate. The PLUS loan is also a fixed interest rate, meaning the interest rate doesn't necessarily change once you've applied and been approved for the loan. the interest rate stays the same throughout the life of the loan. But with a plus loan, the interest rate is going to be higher. So this year in particular, the student loan rate is 4.99%. The plus loan rate is 7.54%. So it is slightly higher, not that much higher, but it is higher. So it's important to remember. The other important thing to remember is that with a plus loan, they've got relatively relaxed credit standards, meaning they're not looking at a ton of information when you do the application and they run your credit. They look at very specific pieces of information, but it tends to be an easier, well, I won't say it specifically like that, but it tends to be a slightly relaxed credit process as you're applying for the loan, which means that a lot of people do get approved for the loan. And if you get approved, the federal government allows you to borrow up to that maximum loan amount. So in the past, that's been a little bit of a problem because it's an easy loan to get approved for, because the process is very, very simple. The federal government makes it very simple for you to borrow. Sometimes people borrow more than they think they're borrowing, and they don't realize it until after they've borrowed it. So it's really important to really pay attention to what's going on. Stay in touch with me, stay in touch with our office as we start doing this loan process. With the plus loan, it is generally, I won't say all the time, but it is generally a good idea to indicate on the loan that you want to borrow the maximum amount. But you have to be very careful when you do that because, as I said, it's very easy to not realize how much you're borrowing. But the reason I would say to indicate that maximum loan amount is then on the back end, you apply for the loan, you get approved for the loan, then you and we go together, we figure out, here's how much we need, here's how much we actually want to borrow, and we only borrow what you need to borrow. But on the flip side, if you indicate that you want to borrow $5,000 and then springtime rolls around and we need a little extra, that's going to be another loan application, a separate loan application. Whereas if you indicate max loan at the beginning, then we have a lot of room, a wiggle room to move around in that loan. So just an important thing to remember. We obviously can, if you decide that the plus loan is the route you want to take, there will be communication between my office and you or your family, and we can figure all of those details out at that point. All right, next lender that I just wanted to quickly mention is the Finance Authority of Maine. I've mentioned them a number of times in previous webinar episodes, but I wanted to mention them one more time because they really are a great resource. Not just talking about loans, they're just a great resource in general for private scholarships, for other potential scholarship and aid programs. They also are a great resource for finding private lenders out there. And then on top of that all, they also offer a private loan of their own, which is the Maine Loan Program. It is open to anybody going to school in the state of Maine, meaning any student attending Maine Maritime Academy can apply for the Maine loan. They generally offer competitive rates. They have for the past couple of years that I've seen their loan rates. So they offer competitive rates and they offer a range of repayment terms. What that means is basically, most standard loans, when you borrow them, especially student loans, they have a lot of deferment options, meaning you can defer payments. You don't have to make payments specifically while you're in school. The plus loan can do that as well. The federal student loans can do that as well. A lot of private lenders offer that option. The FAME loan or the Maine loan specifically allows you the option of making payments. And if you make those payments while the student is in school, then they offer you a lower interest rate. So that's a little perk to making, some payments or larger loan payments while the student is in school. Some other private lenders do that as well, but it is a feature that FAME offers, and I just wanted to make sure y'all were aware of it. So this isn't everything. There's a lot of other lenders out there. Not every student lender is going to be on Elm Select. Not even all of the necessarily quote unquote big names are going to be on Elm. And there are a ton of other student lenders out there. The first place that I would recommend looking, obviously you can go to google.com, look up student loans. You're going to find a ton of information by doing that search. But another great place to look is your local bank. If you have a relationship with a local credit union, local bank, even one of the larger banks out there, especially if you're an established customer, they will often have loan programs available. Not everybody does student loans specifically because they do come with extra challenges like managing those programs, but a lot of the federal credit unions offer student loans. So if you have a relationship with one of them, I would definitely recommend checking it out. They tend to be pretty competitive with their rates and terms. And then again, some of those larger private banks and even smaller local banks will do student loans as well. All right, so the next subject I just wanted to go over quickly is sort of the loan timeline. This is going to be a little, again, a little generalized. We've gone over some of this information already. I'm going to try and go into a detail on a couple small bits as we go through, but I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions because I feel like this is going to be a question-heavy webinar episode. So first step in the loan timeline is budgeting. So we talked about cost of attendance. We talked about minimum, maximum loan amounts, things like that. That's all of our budgeting step one. We're going to be determining that gap. And I would recommend, I'm going to mention this a couple more times before this episode is over. But I'm going to recommend that as we're doing this budgeting, as we're planning for and budgeting for potentially borrowing money, that we are planning for the full academic year. I don't recommend doing it per semester. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on that on the next slide with our frequently asked questions. And then also, as we talked about with the PLUS loan, oftentimes, especially with private loans and the PLUS loan, you can apply for more than you actually quote unquote need. So you can apply for that full amount, potentially up to that maximum loan amount. And then if we need to make adjustments, if you want to adjust down, it's very easy to do that. It's harder on the opposite way. It's harder if you apply for less or budget for less and then find out, okay, I actually need a little extra money. Then again, we're doing a whole new loan application in order to make that happen. So next step in the process is the actual application. So you're going to go to Elm, or you're going to find lenders that you're familiar with that you want to look into, and you're going to compare them. You're going to compare those lenders. You're going to look at rates. You're going to look at terms. You're going to look at some of the details on how long the loans are, what their repayment options are. You're going to look at all of that information. And then, as I said in the previous step, I would recommend, you don't have to do this, but I'm highly recommending that you apply, if you're going to borrow a loan, you apply for the full amount needed for the entire academic year. So whether that's your budgeted minimum loan amount or you decide to go for that maximum loan amount, either way, you want to look at the whole year, both fall and spring semesters. As we do this application process, a lot of these student loans, aside from that PLUS loan that we talked about, a lot of these student loans, the student is going to be the primary borrower. So on this step, I wanted to mention that a cosigner is probably going to be necessary for most dependent undergraduate students. So I say that because, just frankly, a lot of 17 and 18-year-olds don't have a lot of credit history behind them. They haven't borrowed a lot of loans. Maybe they don't have a ton of credit card debt that they've paid off. They don't have a car loan that they're paying off. So they may not have credit history. Lenders really like to see credit history. So a lot of 17, 18-year-old first-year students, they're probably going to need a cosigner. Even if they don't need a cosigner, even if they've got credit history, or you're coming in as a 22, 23-year-old maybe, and you think you're doing really well, it may still be beneficial to have a cosigner. So if you've got someone in your life, a parent, a grandparent, a family friend, who is willing to co-sign on a loan with you to help you with your education, and they have a really great credit score or a very impressive credit history, it's highly recommended to have a co-signer, because there are a ton of benefits to having someone with a rich and robust credit history and a really good credit score on your loan application. It has benefits for rate specifically and foremost, but then there's also benefits potentially to some of the term and some of the other conditions that they may apply to the loan. So you've applied, The next step is certification. So you apply and you get approved for a loan. The first thing that's going to happen after you've been approved is the lender is going to reach out to Maine Maritime Academy. They're going to reach out to me and they're going to say, hey, Ryan, does this student actually go to Maine Maritime Academy? And what is their cost of attendance? And how much financial aid are they getting? Because that calculation that we did on that need calculation that we did, those lenders use that same need calculation to determine whether or not you can borrow the amount of money that you've asked for. So they send information to us. They ask us to certify your information. Once financial aid office has reported on your enrollment status, reported on your cost of attendance information, then we work on scheduling those disbursements. So disbursement is just a word for like cash payment, basically. In the lending world, we call them disbursements. It's an amount of money that gets sent either from a lender or potentially from my offices. It's an amount of money, in the form of scholarships, grants, loans, whatever, that gets sent to the billing office and applied to a student's account. So when we do our certifications for these private loans, we are also scheduling disbursements at that point. So if you decided to do an application for that full academic year, it's typically going to get split. If you decide I need $10,000 for the year, we're going to split it between the fall and the spring semesters. We can split it however you would like us to split it. The federal requirement for the undergraduate student loans, those are split evenly between semesters. They're split right down the middle. There's not a lot of room for, there's not a lot of wiggle room on those semester splits. But for private loans, if you decide you want to borrow $10,000 and you want the whole $10,000 in the fall, you can do that if you want. Usually you can do that if you want. If you decide, I want $6,000 in the fall and I want $4,000 in the spring, we can do that. We can get very, very specific with the amount of money and how those disbursements work. If you change your mind later, we can also change it. So let's say you decide, I want $6,000 in the fall, I want $4,000 in the spring, and we do that. And we get to the spring and you realize, I actually don't need $4,000. I'd rather have $3,000. We can do that too. And when we make those changes, it's going to adjust the amount of loan that you've actually borrowed, as well as change the disbursement amount that gets sent to the school. So the next step is repayment. I just wanted to mention this as a step because shortly after you get those disbursements, usually between 1 and 3 months after you get those disbursements, you're going to receive some kind of notification, usually from the lender, or in federal loan case, you're going to receive it from a federal loan servicer, which is just a company that manages federal loans for the government because they don't do it themselves. They're going to reach out to you. If you haven't established, let's say, an online account, or you haven't provided all of your personal contact information or whatever with the lender, that's the time where they're going to get all of that information and make sure that they've got you on file. For private loans, when you do the application process, they're already asking you all that information. They're already setting up your accounts. Typically, you're applying online. If you want to apply over the phone, I believe that's an option as well. But these days, a lot of people are applying online and doing online applications. And through that process, you will have already set up an account with those private lenders. And a lot of the information that they send out after the disbursement, that first disbursement, a lot of the information is going to be available online. For the federal loans, you're not going to receive basically any information on who's handling your loan or how you made payments on the loan until, like I said, 1 to 3 months after that first disbursement. And that's when those federal loan servicers are going to reach out to you. They're going to say, this is how you set up an account with us. This is how you make payments. If you want to make payments now, if you don't want to make payments now, what your options are. All the lenders are going to have different repayment options. Many of those options are going to be similar. So a lot of the lenders, like I said, allow you to defer payments while you're in school, meaning you don't have to make any payments as long as you are enrolled in school. Some lenders are going to give you a little, maybe an interest rate break if you decide to make some type of payment while you're in school. You can make interest payments, meaning you just pay the amount that's accruing in interest each month. You can make partial interest payments in some cases where you're paying maybe a set amount of money, a smaller set amount of money. There's a lot of benefits, pros and cons that you can kind of figure as you start figuring out how you want to make payments. If you have questions about that stuff, I'm happy to answer them for you. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on it. Just suffice it to say there are options. So kind of figure out what's best for you. And if you have questions about how to figure that out, your lenders can provide that information, but also feel free to reach out and ask me, and I'm happy to try and answer them for you. Then, unfortunately, it's back to step one, and we start that budgeting process all over again for the next academic year. This was a ton of information. I'm going to go into some frequently asked questions real quick. I know that I just went over a ton of stuff, and I'm sure there are questions, and I want to make sure we're leaving enough time for that. So I'm going to move on to the four biggest questions that I get asked about loans. The first one is, what's a good interest rate? And this is a really hard question to answer because it kind of changes. It can change every year. But a rule of thumb that I like to follow personally is to look at whatever that federal direct loan rate is. So like I said, this year, the student loan rate is 4.99%. The plus loan rate is 7.54%, meaning if your loan rate is around there, I'd say you've got a pretty good rate. If you can find something around the federal loan rate, you're doing pretty well. If it's within like 5 points, or I'm sorry, if it's within like 5 percentage points of the federal loan rate, it's honestly not a bad loan rate. And I realize a lot of people might be screaming at their computers right now, but honestly, getting a loan rate of 12% is not outside of the realm of possibility. So that's just something you should prepare for. But there are better loan rates out there. And like I said, having a cosigner with a lot of like a good credit history, a good credit score can really drive that number down. I definitely have seen students have loan rates lower than the federal loan rate. So it is possible. It all depends on on the lender. It depends on the credit terms. It depends on the credit score and credit history of the borrowers on the loan. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. I don't have all the information. A lot of those private lenders, how they make those determinations are closely guarded secrets. Some are very forthcoming with it. There's information about the plus loan and what requirements they have. And I believe FAME also offers kind of a broad overview of what credit requirements they look into. But a lot of the other big name private lenders, they're not giving away those secrets. So it's kind of, talk to me, I guess. If you're concerned that the rate isn't great, talk to me. We can talk it over and see what it is. And then that kind of brings us into our next question, which is, what if I can't get a loan? Or what if my loan rates are really bad? If you've been declined for loans, or you feel like you've got a really bad loan rate, please reach out to me. We do have a limited amount of institutional loan funds available. They often aren't going to cover everybody, and they're not going to cover what everybody needs even. However, in the situation where we've got a student who has been declined, at 5 different lenders, and the one lender that they got a loan through charged them 15%, I would very much like to give that student an institutional loan for a lower fixed rate and a simpler loan process. So if that's something that we can do, or that's something that you're experiencing, please reach out to us. Let us know. I would ask that if that happens, if you get declined for loans, hold on to those emails or letters that you get that say that you've been declined, and also hold on to any description of rates or terms that you've gotten that you think are unfair, so that I can have them for my records as I start, figuring out institutional loan funds for students for 23-24. All right, third question. What if I borrow more than I need? What happens then? So we talked about, as we're doing that budgeting and that maximum loan amount, let's say you decide to do that, and then, well, I've got way more money than I need. I really don't think I needed to borrow this much. What do I do now? Depending on when you figure that out, there are a bunch of different options. So if we're in, August, and you realize, I think I borrowed too much, the bills have come out, everything's been finalized, I don't think I actually needed that much money. If a disbursement hasn't happened yet, meaning that private lender or that federal lender hasn't actually sent money to the school yet, we can make changes. Usually, as long as you give me a week's notice prior to disbursement, we can make changes to your loan. So let me know as soon as you realize any of that stuff. If it's after a disbursement, there are a couple options. Technically, there is a process where our finance office can return funds to a private lender. There is a process where we can return funds for private loans or for federal loans as well. More often, what ends up happening is maybe you've borrowed too much. You wind up with a credit on your student account. You take that credit out as a refund, basically, and then you turn around and make an immediate payment on your loan and pay down the balance on your loan. That tends to be the easiest process, but again, reach out to us, talk to us, and we can figure that out. The last question is, why shouldn't I borrow per semester, Ryan? I mentioned it a couple of times, borrowing for the full academic year. You don't have to. I want to make it very clear. You do not have to borrow for the full academic year if you don't want to. I know that if you're talking about budgeting and you're talking about estimated numbers, sometimes that makes people's skin crawl, and they don't want to deal with fake numbers, basically, and try and figure out how much money they might need. Some people like to get that physical bill in the mail that says, this is how much you owe the school. And then they use that number to figure out down to the penny how much money they need to borrow. I totally support that. That's totally fine if you want to do that. I don't recommend it, but if that's what you choose to do, you're totally allowed to do that. I'm not going to stop you from doing it. The reason it's important, the reason I want to stress it and just put forward the idea of planning and budgeting and borrowing for the full year is that there can be a big difference between a student who borrows, let's say over their 4 years, they borrow 4 private loans to cover each one of those years, and a student who has borrowed every semester for 4 years, meaning now that they've ended school at the end of their 4th year, their 8th semester, they now have 8 private loans that they need to manage. The reason this is important, there's a bunch of factors that go into it, but I can tell you that, for example, Sallie Mae, just as one of the big private lenders out there, and I'm sure other private lenders do this as well, but Sallie Mae offers an option after you've graduated and loan repayment starts. They say, okay, we'll figure out what your financial situation is, how much you can really afford to pay, and we'll let you pay a very low amount of money, a small amount of money. We'll do a minimum loan payment. And let's say it's $50, or let's say it's $100 a month that you have to pay on your loans. Well, a student who has 4 private loans through Sallie Mae is going to be paying 4 $100 payments per month, meaning they're going to be paying $400 a month on those 4 loans at the end of their 4 years. A student who has borrowed 8, even though the amount of money is exactly the same that they've borrowed over their 4 years, that student is going to be paying $800 a month, unless they're planning to consolidate all of their loans, which is an option. And I didn't go into a lot of detail on that, but subject for potentially another day. But it's an important distinction to make, because those 2 students may be in the same financial situation, and suddenly one student is paying twice as much per month on their loans. So important to remember. And that might be an extreme example, but just to give you some perspective. The other important thing to remember is that loan rates change. So those interest rates change. They can change, they can change monthly, they can change yearly. But if you borrow for the full academic year and you do that for fall and spring, and you've signed up for a loan in July and you're all set and ready to go, and then those loan rates go up as they have been for the last year or so, you're locked in at that rate. If you've signed up for a fixed rate, you're locked in for that rate for the entire academic year. Whereas a student who has applied for fall 2023 and then decides to apply for spring 2024 in a separate loan, that student may be getting charged a much higher interest rate on that second loan. It's also possible that the student could be charged a lower interest rate on that second loan. I don't think that's likely, but it is entirely possible. But just an important thing to remember as you're trying to budget and plan ahead, I really think it's beneficial to try and plan for the full academic year. It's an option that's open to you, and I would just recommend that most people take that option. All right, those are the frequently asked questions. I've gone over a lot of information. I see that there are a lot of questions that have come up in the chat, some in the Q&A. I'm going to go to this last page here and say, does anybody have any questions? Zach, what do you got?
I'm going to jump out there and remind you all that just to piggyback on Ryan's last point, you do not pay interest on loan dollars until they are dispersed. So if you're borrowing for that full year and you have a program that accrues interest on your loan while you have debt, while you're in school, you're not paying interest on the spring semester loan amount until it comes to you in that spring term. So you're only paying interest on the fall monies during the fall. I just want to put that out there too. So
Yeah, that's
if
a very
you're
good
worried
point.
about
Thanks,
that
Zach.
idea when you're looking at the schema of looking at 4 versus 8 loans per semester or per year, you are not paying interest on those dollars until they are in your pocket or on your account here at the school. So keep that in mind as well. Unfortunately, Ryan, we had that same mix up with the Q&A session. So I actually am not able to see any of the questions in the Q&A, though I have seen a couple that have come across in the chat, and I've tried to jump on those as quickly as possible. Those should all be available, though I did just have one jump in. Approximately when will cost of attendance be generated? I can actually answer that, and I'll drop a link in the chat. We try to set up our budgets around this time each year, which I know is a little frustrating for those who have applied early action. We do have we have to publicize a general cost of attendance. Every institution actually has to have this publicly available. So we do have a worksheet that's online, and I'm going to drop the link right in the web from our website directly into the chat so that everybody has access to it. And we should be updating that with next year's budget as soon as that becomes available, and that'll be right live on the website. You can find it in the same place.
Cool. Yeah, so I was able to get into the question and answer. I've got a few questions in there that I definitely want to make sure I touch base on. The first question that I want to address is, what are some characteristics of a predatory lender to look out for when looking and comparing loans? That is a great question. Thank you for asking. It's a good question. It's very important to be looking out for predatory loan rates, predatory loan terms. For people who maybe don't know what that means, it just means like loan rates and terms or hidden fees and things that maybe the lender doesn't make very obvious, as you're applying and accepting and, signing on the dotted line on a loan. It's harder to do these days. So that's an important thing to remember. It used to be really, really easy to slip in predatory loan terms and rates into student loans, into any kind of private loan out there. It's a lot harder to do these days. So in the United States, they make it very hard to be a predatory lender. However, it does still happen. So some things to look out for are related to the interest rate. As you're comparing loans, it's important that you look for a specific rate, which is the APR, the annualized percentage rate. The reason that's important is because it's not only going to talk about whatever the interest rate is, it's also going to tell you if there are any hidden fees. So if you see that the interest rate is 6%, but the APR is 10%, that's a good indication that there is something hidden in there that they're not making clear to you. APR is a really good way to compare loans, like compare different lenders, because it generally, by law, has to encompass a lot of fees that maybe aren't obvious right up front. So this is very generalized, but if you're comparing like a single loan and you're comparing the interest rate and the APR, they shouldn't be that far off from each other. They should be relatively similar. Some lenders charge origination fees. Actually, the federal government charges origination fees. A lot of private lenders that I'm familiar with don't charge origination fees. And that basically just means it's an amount of money that they charge right off the top on your loan, so that you maybe borrow $5,000, but the school actually gets $4,500 to put towards your education. I think that's a over exaggeration of origination fees. However, it's a good example. So those are things to look out for, like differences between the interest rate and the APR, if you can find that information. That vast information, and then also, frankly, looking out for some of that fine print. So the terms, the rates, the repayment options, they should all be very straightforward and kind of plain to see. If you have questions about whether it's a good loan or not, I'm happy to look through that information for you. I would say, I don't want to necessarily overgeneralize, but a lot of those big lenders, they've gotten a bad rap in the past. Your Sally Mays, your Discover loans. People may have bad things to say about them, but if you're reading through everything, they generally and usually by law are required to make things very, very plain and clear. But if you're confused, if things look weird, definitely reach out and just feel free to send me, the fine print, and I can let you know if it seems off to me or not. The second question is, under what circumstances would a loan interest rate fluctuate? That's a really good question. So I had a whole slide. I think I mentioned it before. I had a whole slide in here that's filled with glossary terms. I'm going to put it up at the end. One of those glossary terms is fixed versus variable interest rate. So the question related to interest rates fluctuating, I think that you can answer it two ways. The first way that I might answer that is just rates in general fluctuating year over year. Can be related to the markets, how the federal government is doing. A lot of that information is very broad and general, but in general, the last year or so, most loan rates have increased. They've gone up over the last I would say about 2 years. But more specifically, if you're talking about fluctuation in an individual loan rate over the life of a loan, meaning over the, let's say, 10 years you have to repay the loan after you graduate, that could be related to what's called a variable interest rate. So a lot of lenders offer an option. FAME, as an example, doesn't. FAME only offers fixed rates. The federal government only offers fixed rates. Some lenders offer you a variable rate option. Sometimes those variable rates tend to be, a little higher. Sometimes those variable rates tend to be a little lower. And that's kind of depending on what the market might be. But what's important about those variable rates is that they can change. They can change on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis over the lifetime of your loan. And usually that's because they're tied to what's called a benchmark rate. So that's going to be, this is a lot more information than you need, but that's probably going to be something like the New York, the prime rate, or the federal funds rate, which is the rate that banks get money from the federal government. When that rate changes, sometimes your loan rate might change. When the mortgage rate changes, sometimes your loan rate might change if you have a variable rate. So it all depends on what your variable rate is fixed to. So some lenders use different metrics. So that's an important thing to keep an eye on. But in general, they tend to fluctuate. A lot of those markets, regardless of what that benchmark rate is, a lot of those markets tend to fluctuate in similar directions. So that would be loan interest rate fluctuation. I had a question about the FAME loan. Is the FAME loan only open to Maine residents? It's not. I think I addressed that in on the page that I talked about looking for lenders. The the FAME main loan is open to any student who is attending Maine Maritime Academy. So the way they bill it is that it's open to Maine students who are going to school outside of state of Maine, and then anybody who's going to school in the state of Maine at certain schools. What's up?
Ryan, may I ask a clarifying question on that?
Yes,
Are international students allowed to apply for the FAME main loan?
that's a great question. I don't know. I don't believe, well, I don't want to say. I don't know. Definitely go to FAME, check that out. There are, just as a good question, thank you, Zach, for bringing it up. There are definitely lenders out there that allow international students to borrow.
Empower is one that we've seen with success at our students. So I put that in the chat earlier. So if you want the link to Empower financing, it's up in the chat box right now.
Yeah, and there are other lenders that do it as well. Not all of them do. Some of them do require you to be a U.S. citizen in order to borrow. But there are definitely lenders out there that specifically for student loans will allow international students to borrow. Let's see. Historically, with past government shutdowns, how does that affect those fluctuating rates? Okay. That's kind of tough to answer. But really, the rate fluctuations don't tend to be huge. I think, I'm sure I'm going to get some of these numbers wrong, but historically, loan rates have been from, I don't know, 2% to maybe 20% in the past 30, 40 years or something. Like that 20% is a really, really high number. I think more realistically, the rates have been on average, probably between, I don't know, 3 and 15% maybe over the last like 15 or 20 years. So they're not fluctuating that much. And again, I've got students who are coming in, they're applying for private loans. I've got some students who have gotten, 3% interest rates, and I have gotten some students who have gotten 15% interest rates. I would say if your rate is above 15%, like come and talk to me, because I think that's probably a little high. But, if someone's watching this webinar in 2 months, that might not be accurate anymore. So they do fluctuate. It has a little bit more to do, I think. I think government shutdowns specifically, I haven't really noticed that those have an enormous impact on rates. But more generally, it has to do with market changes. So housing market changes, and sometimes the federal funds rate will change if the government is trying to slow down or boost the economy, and sometimes that will change some rates across the market as well. Zach, you got anything for me?
Yeah, actually, I'll let you jump on this one. I was going to answer it real quick, but since you're kind of at the end of what was in Q&A, I'm going to put this one to you. So Juliet asked, how does the government decide if and when and how much a student is offered in subsidized versus unsubsidized loans? What is an example of the rate differences, and are subsidized loans sometimes interest-free while students are in school? Are subsidized loans, to be fair, are always interest deferred until after the student has graduated, but I'll let Ryan jump in on the other 2 parts of that question.
Yeah. So
do you need me to read it again?
No, I think I got it. So to clarify, yes, subsidized loans, while you are enrolled in school, they are not accruing a dime of interest while you are in school. Unsubsidized loans, they do accrue interest while you're in school. The way that calculation is made, again, kind of goes back to our need calculation. So a student who, after you've done the math and you've taken your cost of attendance and you've subtracted out that expected family contribution, that number that you get after you've completed the FAFSA, you take the difference between those 2 numbers, and that's your need. If that need is $1, you can have $1 of subsidized loans. That's kind of how they make that calculation. Most students, well, I won't say that. it's kind of hard to fall in that range where you're only getting like, I don't know, you're only getting $10 of subsidized loans. It's kind of hard to fall in that range. I'm sure there are students that do fall in that range. It's just the odds are kind of slim. Usually your family has made, maybe has very significant financial income that they have reported on the FAFSA, and there is no need, meaning that student is going to get the full loan amount in an unsubsidized loan, or your family tends to have maybe a much lower financial reporting on the FAFSA, and you're going to have full need. One important thing to remember is that the unsubsidized loan portion is always at least $2,000. So any student who's going to be borrowing federal loans, even if they are, high need category kind of student, they're still the split is still gonna be 2,000 unsubsidized, and the rest of their federal loan allotment is going to be that subsidized portion. Was there another part to that question that I missed, Zach?
What is the example of different rate differences?
Oh, so there's no rate difference between subsidized or unsubsidized. Like I said, this year, the federal student direct loan rate is 4.99%. So regardless of whether it's subsidized or unsubsidized, that's the fixed rate. So when you graduate, those loans are going to be accruing interest at that rate. The unsubsidized portion just starts accruing as soon as those disbursements are made, whereas the unsubsidized portion doesn't start accruing interest until after you've graduated or potentially disenrolled for another reason.
All right. And so Andrea had asked, are we a yellow ribbon school? The answer is yes. But she also asked how many slots are available here at Maine Maritime. And I don't know the answer, but I also warned her that you may not know that exact number either.
So there are 12 slots, period. And I know that there are a number of them already filled, but I think the last time I checked, there were still slots open. So I don't know how many slots are open, and we kind of can't make that determination until much closer to the start date of school, because the VA kind of plays a part in those determinations, and those VA benefits aren't officially certified and determined until 30 days before the school year starts. So we can't assign yellow ribbon to incoming students if there are any slots available. We can't assign those until benefits have been certified 30 days prior to the first day of school. So I guess it's a complicated way of saying I don't really know, but there is an application online on our website for the Yellow Ribbon program. So go ahead and fill out the application. You'll at least get your name in there. If you're, for everybody else who's listening, we're talking about veteran benefits, so this may not apply to you, but if you have veteran benefits that you're using and you want to be considered for the Yellow Ribbon program, definitely get your veteran documentation into the school, and then also fill in that Yellow Ribbon application on the website. And then those decisions again are made within that first, basically within the month prior to school starting. What else you got, Zach?
Chris and I just asked
yeah, we're kind of running.
Yellow Ribbon was, so.
Yeah, we're kind of running on the end here.
Yeah.
I know we technically have run out of time. So I'm just so that it's there, I'm gonna stick around. I will definitely answer more questions if people have them. But just so it's here, I'm also gonna pull up this thing that I called the loan lexicon, which is our glossary, which I've sort of broken out into a couple different categories. I'm just gonna put this information on here. If you have questions about it, feel free to ask them. I'll stick around for a little bit longer so that this information is available in the recording. But otherwise, thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. Feel free to hop off if you want to, and you can check back here if you had questions about any of this information that you think maybe we're going to be answered, or you want to refer back to any of this information, it is going to be posted on the website. So.
Yeah, perfect. I did also change Ryan and I's names here under our nameplates to our email addresses. If you have any questions that are popping in your brain that come up after the session, reach out to us individually, or if you have a very specific question about a loan or about your students' account or aid profile, anything to do with that, just reach out to us on an individual basis, and we can try to break down some of those tougher, more specific questions in a private setting instead of publishing them here. Kristen also asked for tips for non-high school, so some of our non-traditional students looking for scholarships. This was one that she actually submitted earlier, and Ryan and I have talked about this one a lot. There are definitely scholarships out there and available institutionally, nationally, privately for non-traditional students. There's a lot of lifetime learner scholarships that are available. There are plenty of those out there. So yes, some of them are geared more towards high school students that are graduating into higher ed, but there are plenty out there to cover everybody. Ron, you have anything to say about that too?
Yeah, I would say if you're looking for scholarships as maybe a non-traditional or a student who's not coming straight out of high school, I think there's a ton of I think there's probably a ton of scholarships out there that are available. I mean, just speaking from our endowments, I think there's only a small handful that are supposed to be specifically directed to incoming high school students. Most of the loans are, sorry, we've been talking about loans, so I'm a little discombobulated. Most of those scholarships are actually available to any student, regardless of what their high school was, or what their high school GPA, or whether they're coming straight out of high school or not. So if you're running into, as you're looking for scholarships, if you're running into a bunch of scholarships that are directed specifically to high school students, I think that's likely just because they tend to be the ones that are, they tend to be the ones that are doing the most legwork on private scholarships, frankly. But that does not mean that there aren't private scholarships out there for non-high school students. They just tend to be advertised, I think, more commonly to high school students. And I think there's probably a lot of scholarships out there that maybe are geared towards high school students, but is not a specific requirement of that scholarship. So that's something to just keep in mind as well. I just saw the one that came in. Are there scholarships that cover room and board? That's a really good question. There aren't, not that I have. And I would say a private scholarship organization probably is not going to be directing funds in that way. We don't specifically have an endowed scholarship that covers either of those things. However, if you're here for a little while, living on campus, and you decide to become, let's say, for example, a what are they called? RAs. If you're an RA on campus, meaning you're sort of working with our student activities department and helping maintain order in the residence halls, those students do get a room waiver. So that's something that comes in, to my office, and I send over to the finance office, and they get applied to a student bill, and it's directly related to how much it costs to have a room on campus. I know that there are, not a lot of students that get selected for that role, so they tend to be highly competitive positions. And I don't believe that freshmen are able to apply for those positions, but I could be wrong about that. Please don't quote me on that. But suffice it to say, there are room waivers available, but they are, they are kept solely for those RA positions. So that's the only thing that I can really think of that would specifically cover that. All right, yes. I don't see a ton of stuff out there.
And I responded to Jonathan here, but I'll respond vocally to everybody. Thank you guys for participating. You are all the reason that we are continuing to do these sessions. If you have questions, I'm sure you're not the only person who has them. So these sessions have been kind of a culmination of some questions that we've gotten individually from people. We are so happy to be doing these. The participation level for this series specifically has been incredibly high. So we appreciate that everyone spends their time taking a look at these. Hopefully it helps in the process. And as long as people keep participating and finding value here, Ryan and I are dedicated to taking the time to make sure that we can put these on for everybody. This has been wonderful, another great session. We did want to talk about one quick thing, deviation from plan. We are changing the platform for our next session, which is going to be in March. This one is going to be a little bit different than we had originally planned. It was going to be all about maximizing your financial aid package. If you watch each one of the siloed pieces of the series, you should be able to do that between the 4 different pieces that we've talked about to this point. So what we're going to do instead is do about a 15-minute review on that session. Then we're just going to open up for any question that you want to have about the world of financial aid. We're actually going to be joined by Ryan's assistant director, Angela Wiley. So I'll kind of MC and pitch questions to them, and then we'll get to hear their answers kind of live and in person, which is going to be really great, because it's this Q&A part at the end that usually has the greatest response and participation. So we want to make sure that we get everyone the opportunity to voice those questions. And again, if you have a question, you're probably not the only person who does. So it can be incredibly helpful to everybody watching as well. So that's a little bit of a tweak to the planning. We will still have our April session that stays the same, but March is going to change just a little bit. And we're thinking that that's going to be a much better use of time. For both us and for you all who have participated to this point. Ryan, do you have anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I don't know if, oh, did you actually, you maybe already addressed this one. I was going to say, Amber, if Amber's still on, Amber asked about when you should apply for loans at the latest. I think you did kind of mention that. Typically, beginning of summer, yeah, that's a really good, again, rule of thumb. Honestly, to be perfectly candid, if it winds up that you get halfway through the fall semester and you realize I need to pay my bill, I still haven't fully paid my bill, and I can't sign up for spring classes, you'd be surprised. Maybe you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't, how many students I talk to that are in that exact situation. You can apply for a loan then. So, yes, I would say a good rule of thumb is to have all of that stuff figured out, before those July bills even come out. But plenty of people wait until those bills come out just so they can make sure that things are finalized. And I totally get that. And that totally makes sense to wait for that, July, August timeframe to do that budgeting. And again, I've got students who, frankly, 3 weeks ago were applying for their first loans to pay for their fall bill. So we see all different types here. Were there new questions or just?
That was it.
That was it. Okay.
Good. Well, free and clear, we did go over just a little bit, but again, this last little bit has been great to actually leave this lexicon page up so that when you guys go back and watch this recording, you can anything that we kind of throw out as far as loan jargon, you can kind of come back here and say, what did that mean? Oh yeah, that's that thing. Okay, perfect. Now I understand it. And again, if any questions do come up between now and the next time that we have a session, email myself, email Ryan. We are happy to help along the way. It's the whole reason we do this. Thank you all again for participating, and we look forward for the next one.
Oh, I did actually just get,
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I did get one last question that came into the Q&A session, which is, my son is waiting to hear if he is an NROTC scholarship recipient, should he still accept the awards on the financial aid page? That's a really good question. On the financial aid page, the awards that you're going to be accepting or declining, those are the federal loans. So honestly, if you want to wait and see, that's totally up to you. You can choose to wait and see. Those loans and the sort of process for those loans won't start until you accept them. So if you're going to take them, then obviously there'll be some legwork once you have actually accepted them. If you choose that you don't want to accept them right now, you want to kind of wait and see what they look like, it's really okay if you wait, and we can do that process later. They'll always be there. They'll be available to you. Federal loans, it takes a long time for those to drop off the table as an option for you. So if you decide, even as we're getting to the end of spring 2024, you say, you know what, I think maybe I did want those loans. At that point, we can still do it. So you've got time, and if you want to wait because you're waiting on a scholarship, or you're waiting up on a potential grant, or you're waiting on maybe grandma's gonna, give you some of her, retirement interest income or something crazy like that, definitely you can wait and see. I don't have any problem with that.
And also good luck to your student. That's an incredible honor to get a 4-year scholarship. It's very competitive. So I hope I have best of luck. It's a tremendous accomplishment to even apply for that. From my understanding, it was a very difficult process. So good for you. All right.
So thank you so much, everybody. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys sticking around. Again, send us an email if you come up with questions after we've ended it. Feel free to reach out, send us an email, or give me a call. Happy to answer any questions that come up. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.